And so again, let's remember to always love one another and to honor this garden of a planet that we live on. Let us be grateful for what we have and for one another. And I'd like to ask a round of applause for Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson.
Can I ask a question? I see many familiar faces here. Do a lot of you come regularly to the Earthkeeper conferences?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a special event, isn't it?
Yes.
It's something really special in the world. I go and speak at a lot of places, but there's something very special about this one. I think it has a lot to do with you and Anne. Yeah, that's that feeling of family and connectedness. It's a good thing. It's what we all need as human beings. Randall doesn't know the suspense he's building up.
Yes. Let's have another round of applause for Randall and Graham.
The computer is still not working. Who needs it? Who needs it? Let's
do a little Q&A.
No, let's do it. We've got a few things to talk about first. Let's. Okay, you're going to be up there. I'm going to be down here. We can swap. Ladies and gentlemen, part of what I want to do this evening is to introduce you to Randall Carlson. Randall and I have had occasion to work together on a number of projects over a number of years, and I've got to know Randall well. You know, there are many people in this world who argue from authority, who say, I'm a scientist, I'm an archaeologist, I'm a paleontologist, I'm a geologist, I know what I'm talking about. You just listen to me and you don't have to think for yourselves. Well, there's a wonderful tradition of the man in the street who follows his curiosity and who follows the mystery and who walks the walk on the ground for years and years and years and years and years. And that's what Randall has been doing, and he's been walking that walk with geology. Even though he's not a professor of geology at any university, I would say Randall knows more about geology in the tip of his little finger than most highly qualified geologists teaching at universities know. And I would say that Randall's life story is a kind of a message for us all, that we don't have to be, you know, what society has simply channeled us into, that we can pursue our interests and we can make huge contributions to human knowledge. The academic qualifications are way overblown. They are way overblown. What you want to know is, what does this person know and how do they put it across? And Randall, to me, is a shining example of a person who's followed his curiosity, followed it in depth for years, exploring the land. When he took me to the Channel Scablands, this was a revelation to me. Had I not had the privilege of doing that journey with Randall, I would not have seen what I saw, just because, as he says, you know, you just don't notice these things. But when you've trained yourself through years on the road to really see it, then you can communicate it. This is what Randall does. So, the first thing I would like to ask you to do, Randall, is to just tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your day job? How did you get here? How did you get into this fascination with geology and with walking the walk on the ground? How did it happen?
This is a question I've been asked quite frequently, and I really haven't come up with the definitive answer yet. All I can say is I think it goes back to just being raised in an environment that encouraged intellectual pursuits, having a good, hardworking father who built things with his hands and designed things, and having a mother and a grandmother that encouraged me to read and to be interested in science from the age of 7 or 8 years old. Growing up in rural Minnesota, where I grew up is in an area pretty much where the great ice sheets came down and fluctuated back and forth over a period of, thousands of years and shaped the landscape. I grew up on a little meltwater pond, a glacial pond, where I could sit in my backyard and fish. And right next to our property was a big old erratic boulder. And I used to sit on that boulder and vanquish imaginary dragons and monsters and things like that. And it's occasionally wondering, why is this big boulder sitting here? Big black boulder. I don't even remember what kind of rock it is. I've often thought I should go back and see if it's still there. But we used to go spend so much time outdoors in nature. It just became something that I was interested in. As a kid, remember the potholes that we visited on our last day?
You bet.
Yeah, now that was, what I'm referring to here is a feature that's up along the St. Croix River that forms the border between Wisconsin and Minnesota. And there's a basalt outcrop there. And at the end of the last ice age, during the Great Meltdown, whatever the cause of that meltdown, there was a massive flood that came down through Lake Superior and it was channeled along the St. Croix River.
Okay, so St. Croix River, there is an outcrop of basalt there. And as a kid, we used to go up there hiking. Later I would go up there camping. And right there in this basalt outcrop are these gigantic potholes. And I'll probably pull up a slide here in a second. I actually showed a slide earlier today of one of those. And there's about 20 or 30 of them in this basalt outcrop. At the time I had no idea of catastrophic floods, but nonetheless, I was very intrigued by why are these big holes in the rock here, some of them 20, 25 feet in diameter and 80 feet deep. And it wasn't until later that I came to understand the effects of turbulent hydraulic phenomena like that, and that it can actually literally form like an underwater tornado that just picks up debris and can drill right into bedrock. So that was definitely a factor that helped to stimulate my thinking. Another one was, it was summer of 1969, and there's an airport outside of Minneapolis, which was the nearest town before I grew up. Flying Cloud Airport, and they used to have rock concerts set up in a field outside of Flying Cloud Airport. And Flying Cloud Airport is on a bluff that's about 250 feet high, a series of bluffs, and there's a large channel that the modern Minnesota River flows in. So one day I went to the rock concert and I just wanted to take a break, and I wandered away and I was standing on top of the bluff looking out into this huge valley and looking at the little Minnesota River, which is not that little of a river actually, but nonetheless the river's winding through there. And I was looking and I was noticing that there were banks on both sides of the river, and then 4 miles on the other side was another set of banks, right? And I just had this impression that just kind of lodged in my brain, and it just never went away. It sort of gestated in the back of my consciousness. So, probably that was 69, and I think probably by mid-70s, I had been reading a lot of mythology, which was something I was very interested in really since I was a kid. So reading all this mythology, it's filled with apocalyptic visions and stories of great catastrophes and everything. So about the mid-70s, when I really started into this pursuit of trying to understand how there might be a connection between ancient traditions and modern traditions of science, I would think back to this scene of this great valley. And I showed a slide earlier today that was the Snake River flowing in a large channel, right? Now, this is called by geologists an underfit river, right? And basically, what we now know is that most of the rivers in North America are flowing in oversized channels. And for example, Little Rock sits on a set of bluffs And almost 100 miles to the east of here is Memphis that sits on another set of bluffs. And there's a whole vast floodplain between these two towns. This was actually the channel of these great meltwater floods coming off what's called the Laurentide ice sheet. And it came down and there was a huge volume of water that came down through here and left this vast, wide floodplain. So literally, while this meltwater is traversing from up in basically the area of Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico, if you were standing where Little Rock is now looking to the east, or standing at Memphis on the bluffs looking to the west, all you would have seen was a turbulent sea moving. Fresh water, because it's meltwater coming off the glaciers. But in the summer of 1970, I spent the whole summer pretty much traveling around the western states. That included Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Washington, and Oregon, camping out and hiking. And that summer really just ignited my interest in the land, the landscapes, what was the story here. I can still remember going down through the Columbia Gorge. And if you all have ever been through the Columbia Gorge, you know how spectacular it is. And there are these extraordinary features, these massive deltas that splay out from the tributary rivers of the Columbia. And I would look at those and I would go, I know what is this? And at the time I thought, God, I could never understand this. This is just, it's here. And most people look at the land and it just is. A hill is just a hill, right? A valley is just a valley. But I would definitely say that summer, that 3 or 4 months that I spent out there walking over, and I did a lot of hitchhiking too, because you could do that back in those days, that really inspired my interest in trying to understand the story of the landscape. And so
a kind of hook of curiosity was
absolutely.
And you followed that through. I mean, you talk about a hiking and camping trip then, but your work method investigating these mysteries involves constant journeys and travels. You take several trips a year.
Several trips a year, yeah. With my good friend and colleague back there, Brad Young, without whom I really wouldn't have been able to do it like that. So he's been by my side as we've
just to satisfy my and perhaps the audience's curiosity.
Okay.
You're a builder, right?
Yes.
Just tell us a little bit about that. Just a little bit about it.
Okay, well.
Tell us about the building, because what I'm interested in, most people are what they're labeled to be. A builder is a builder. Mm-hmm. A surgeon is a surgeon. Whatever, and that's what they do. But I'm interested in people who will not be channeled into that, and who branch out and follow their curiosity, and often lead to great revelations for humanity as a result. So just a little bit of the balance between these two aspects of your life.
Okay, well, once I hit college age, I was actually taking courses and auditing courses, but I was at the time more interested in philosophy and spirituality, so I was taking courses in Sanskrit so I could try to understand some of the Vedic writings and things like that. And of course, I've forgotten all of it. I occasionally will recognize a word. But, I thought, there's something I need to do here to make a living. And the things that I did, I worked so many different jobs, factory jobs. I worked in a slaughterhouse cleaning up the blood and gore and stuff that was left after the butchers got done. I sold newspapers on the street and did other things that maybe weren't exactly legal. You do what you got to do. But finally I said, okay, I need to do something. And it turned out, my father was a master carpenter, master builder.
Right.
Swedish. His grandfather was an immigrant from Sweden. He was a master carpenter. So I had come up and I had learned a few things in spite of myself about that particular trade. And I just decided that, okay, I'm sick of working in factories. I'm sick of working day labor jobs. I did everything, from like unloading rocks from boxcars, So I actually, what happened was, summer of 1972, I was with a group, a meditation group up in Minneapolis that was being taught by this Brahmin priest named Dr. Arya. And he was actually the Sanskrit professor that I managed to study with for a while. And he had a spiritual master named Swami Rama. Well, we were going to have a retreat up in the north woods of Minnesota, and we had an architect in the group who wanted to, back then geodesic domes were very popular.
I recall.
Right? So he came up with two designs for a geodesic dome. One was a 3/8 dome, which if you can imagine a sphere, and you cut 3/8 of the top of it off. And the other was a 5/8 dome, so you cut 3/8 off the bottom, and now it does like this. And he designed it to have a spire, which he called the Bindu point. Well, then, because I had had some carpentry experience, me and my two brothers that were involved in this as well, we kind of got drafted to be the lead carpenters on these projects. So we proceeded to build these two domes, and this was my first introduction to geodesic geometry. And I just found it utterly fascinating. And we got old scrap wood. We were able to put these things together up in the woods. I don't know if they're still there, but we assembled these things. I had to learn geodesic geometry in order to lay out, because each of the pieces, that struts that come together, have compound angles on them. So I had to figure out and learn the geometry.
Keep the mic close.
Keep it close, okay. So then, one of the domes, the Bindu dome, that was a very interesting structure, was featured in a national publication called Shelter, which was a big, oversized kind of magazine format. And in there, what they were looking at was all kinds of alternative architecture, vernacular architecture, sacred architecture, looking at these traditions of building from all over the world. And because this dome that I helped to build was featured in there, I procured my copy of it. And then as I started reading through it, I got really fascinated by these building techniques, building methodologies, building philosophies throughout the ages. That was my very first exposure to the idea of sacred geometry. My first exposure to the idea of the golden section, which I've tried to employ in my work ever since then. So I just got very fascinated by building and architecture. And as I got into it, I made a trip to Europe and journeyed around looking at all kinds of architecture and noting that so much of it was symbolic. And then realizing that in that was profound messages and stories that had been preserved in these sacred structures. As I got into that, I had almost like parallel lines of research and evidence. So while I was immersing myself in studies of the Vedas and all of this in the Eastern traditions, I'm looking at this architecture and, like medieval Christian architecture in the cathedrals, for example, and photographing all of the facades and the symbols, and coming to understand that there was a very sophisticated astronomy embedded in these structures. So that was a very awakening epiphany for me. I just got very interested in building, design, architecture.
These days, how much time do you spend each year on the road pursuing your geology, and how much time?
I'm like split half and half.
50-50.
Now I've gotten to the point, my younger brother is our project manager. What'll happen is somebody will come to us. I'm working on a project right now that'll probably come out at about $400,000, and it's going to be a family-oriented pub that's going to be built in Decatur where I live. And I've incorporated a lot of very interesting patterns and sacred geometry. And in fact, that's why the proprietor of this, who is the co-owner of he's from Ireland, and he's very interested in Celtic stuff. So we've incorporated some Celtic symbolism into the design.
So broadly speaking, it's not a matter of your day job and your passion. Your passion is involved in everything.
Yeah, I love what I do.
You love what you do?
I love what I do, yeah. So I do that, but I've got it now to where, it's gone from, in times past, where I would do 60, sometimes 70 hours a week, where I can devote a lot of time right now to doing the design of a project. I'll turn it over to my brother, and he'll go with the team, and that's what I'm doing right now. I'm about this close to being done with it. I'll have a day or two to work on it when I get back. I'll turn it over to them, and the team will be busy for the next 4 months. And then I will be, who knows what adventure will be.
Okay. So this is what I'm coming to, because really the focus of your geological research, and ladies and gentlemen, I cannot emphasize to you enough how solid the research that this man does is, how foot on the ground it is, how meticulous and painstaking and thorough it is, how he reads every single scientific paper on a subject that he's investigating before he goes further, does the field work, does the research, but the focus of it really has been on this world-changing episode, 12,900, 12,800 years ago, that they call the Younger Dryas. The Ice Age is coming nicely and gently and politely to an end, and then something happens, and it just smashes the world into a sudden reversal, and the world is suddenly, it's been warming up for thousands of years, and then suddenly it's back in the depths of the Ice Age again. But weirdly, right at the beginning, just at the very beginning of that, there's a huge release of water into the world ocean, and we have this anomalous rise in sea level at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Then there's a pause, and then a big one at the end of the Younger Dryas. Clearly, as a human species, we're taught by the school system to think of civilization as something that's 5,000 years old, and we're really not much interested in stuff before that. We call it prehistory. But it's just yesterday, 12, 13,000 years ago, in terms of the story of our species, is just yesterday. And something extraordinary happened. And Randall, you've been investigating and digging into this for decades. And I would like you to give us your vision of what happened 12,800 years ago. What do you think happened to America? What do you think happened to the world then?
Well, I came to think, that we had to broaden our perspective and start thinking in terms of the cosmic domain. I mean, that's somewhere, by the 80s, I was into thinking we've got to look that we're part of a much larger system. So I've studied quite a bit into the role of comets in human history, and we discovered that they have played a very powerful role, and they're embedded in symbolism. There's all kinds of traditions from all over the world about comets. I also looked into the sun. When I was in 89, I was in Europe, and I went to a place called Ande, where there's this little monument, which was written about by a mysterious gentleman, presumably alchemist, by the name of Fulcanelli. And in my travels around Europe, I went there and photographed it. I might be able to find one of the photographs that I took of it. But it is a monument to what he called Kielism or Kielism. I don't know the exact pronunciation, but basically this is what I think the gentleman that was before us, I didn't get to hear all of his talk, but it basically deals with the cycle of catastrophes, Judgment Day, that kind of thing. And one of the things on there was the facade. As you walk up to this monument, it's now sitting in a little churchyard. There's a carving of a very angry sun face with multiple rays coming out of two distinct lengths. And so, looking at that, I started thinking, well, this is clearly indicating the role of the sun. But then I went on, and on another side of it, it shows an ellipse with a cross in it and 4 letter A's, which most of the commentary on it by Fulcanelli seemed to indicate that was a symbol of 4 ages of the world. And so I think at the time I was probably really getting into this idea of incursions of things from space. And of course, 1980, that was the year that the publication showing the impact of the Cretaceous Tertiary.
The dinosaurs, the KT event.
That I think we're all in agreement on that happened.
Yes.
At that point. Now, and there was a very large crater in Mexico, and I later went down there and explored, went diving into the cenotes to try to, which are sinkholes that around the rim of that giant submerged crater, which led me into looking at Mayan traditions. And I mentioned earlier in the talk today about one of the ceremonies that they would do, where they would throw these carvings of serpents with burning copal resin down into the the well of sacrifice. Anyways, I would say that 80, it was to me it was electrifying when it came out because I was one of those boys, young boys in the 50s that was absolutely obsessed with dinosaurs. Anything to do with dinosaurs. I had my little dinosaur models, I built plastic models, any dinosaur movie that came out, any dinosaur book I had. And really I had that interest right up until probably my late teen years, and then when I kind of shifted over and started exploring spiritual philosophy and things like that, I kind of lost my interest in that. But then when 1980 came along and the research came out by the actually 3 different teams.
Yeah, confirming the dinosaurs were turned into chickens by a massive cosmic impact.
Yes, and that
which tells us that these things happen. But I want to kind of cut to the chase a little bit.
Okay.
Cosmic impacts have been on the table today, and we have also discussed the sun today. We all know that something terrible happened to the world and happened to the human family between 12,800 years ago and 11,600 years ago. Terrible, terrible things happened. And we're all looking for answers to those questions. I'm going to put this to you straight away. We did ask Robert Schock to join us today on the stage in an open discussion about these matters. Robert Schock presented a number of papers which seem to completely dismiss the Younger Dryas comet impact theory. Do you feel that that's an accurate presentation?
Well, I've been through, I didn't see a single paper up there that I haven't been through with a fine-tooth comb. There is a team that have really set out from the beginning to discredit this idea. And Robert showed the slide. I just think I showed the slide, or maybe you showed the slide of the 2007 paper.
Yeah.
And my thought was that initially, this is a very interesting idea. It could explain a lot. Then the response came out, and it was pretty savage initially against it. Once I began doing some, like I said, I went through those, and then I would see what we would now call the Comet Research Team respond to that. And like I said, I went through all of these articles with fine-tooth comb, and I've had the opportunity to get to know George Howard there, who runs the Cosmic Tusk website, an excellent website, by the way, that gives a great summation of a lot of this information that we're talking about. I cannot recommend it enough. Through him and through Graham, I have met quite a number of the researchers that are in the forefront of promoting the idea that there was an impact that happened at about 12,800, 12,900 years ago. I discovered when I started looking into the background of some of these fierce critics that a lot of them, or at least some of them, enough to suggest to me that there might have been kind of a political motive there, which is that there is a sort of this whole phenomenon of the Anthropocene now, which is that humans are now the dominant geological force. For the moment we may be, but within the big picture of things, our imprint could fade into relative insignificance.
Yeah.
But within the Anthropocene concept is this idea of the 6th great mass extinction. Now when that first started getting proposed 4, 5, 6 years ago, I had already worked my way through the exhaustive literature on mass extinction episodes in Earth history. Generally it came down to 2 causes: impacts or large-scale volcanism. And it's sometimes probably correlating, because we know that during the Cretaceous Tertiary impact there was also the huge outpouring of the Deccan Traps in India that just dumped enormous amounts of sulfate aerosols and so forth into the atmosphere. We also know during the Permian Triassic there is some evidence suggesting that that was triggered by an impact. But also large-scale volcanism, the Siberian traps, again, huge, massive floods.
Well, if I'm correct about the Deccan Traps, that asteroid or comet that extinguished the dinosaurs, smacking into the Gulf of Mexico, put shockwaves all the way through the planet,
All the way
right to the other side, to India,
Yeah, some
and
of the
caused that explosive volcanism. Yeah.
Some of the structural geologists who wrote papers on this suggested it could have caused the collapse of every fault line on Earth and triggered, because the Deccan traps, the outpouring, the point of outpouring is at the antipodes of the impact.
Yeah.
Now there are some Indian geologists that have proposed that there was actually a large impact in the Indian Ocean that seems to date to the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary. Anyway, so there's 5 great mass extinctions. You know, the late Ordovician, the Permian-Triassic, which was the most devastating of all, in which 90 to 95% of all species on Earth went extinct. Having gone through the papers in the wake of the Cretaceous-Tertiary event, it was interesting that, you know, as you begin to ponder the phenomena, that, you know, there was a global storms ignited. That was followed by a cosmic winter because of all the soot and dust and debris that was, and sulfate aerosols that were injected into the atmosphere. It was likely that there were weeks at a time where large portions of the planet were swathed in total darkness. There was acid rain, intense acid rain. You know, the list of stuff just goes on. And having become familiar with these, you know, the late Ordovician, the late Devonian, the Jurassic extinction, it occurred to me that, wait a second, how can we now say we're in a 6th extinction that's comparable to those? My thought was some of these guys need to get up and get away from their computers and look out the window.
Yeah.
Because we're not.
So what you're saying is that many of the critics, and I know for a fact that this is true, many of the critics of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis have a vested interest, effectively, in the overkill model, in the idea
Let's
that we
explain
were the cause.
what the overkill model is.
Yeah.
Okay, so within this, when they are justifying this idea that we're now causing a mass extinction that's equivalent in magnitude to the Permian-Triassic and to the Cretaceous-Tertiary, if you question that, they cite as a precedent, well, look, we've already done that. We killed off the megafauna 12,000, 13,000 years ago.
Right.
We did that,
Yeah.
right? We did that. And this idea of the overkill hypothesis, which I mentioned briefly this morning, has been the dominant theory for the mass extinction of the megafauna since the 1960s. Now I got to say that the mass extinction of the megafauna at the end of the last ice age is nowhere near the scale of the Great Five. Because basically we're talking about the top of the food chain getting decapitated, if you will. And what happens there is that if you have a large-scale habitat loss, it's the large species that are going to suffer the first because they need the most food. They require much longer turnover times between generations. They have longer times to raise their young to where they can survive on their own, right? If you put these factors in, if you have a habitat loss, it's going to affect the large species first, and then it's going to work its way down. So the number of species lost, which was about half of the megafaunal species on Earth at the time. And here's a statistic that you can think about. The number of species of megafauna, which is actually defined as a creature that's 44 kilograms or about 100 pounds in body weight. So that would include us. We're all megafauna in this room. So the idea was that the megafauna went down. The number of species was over 100 species, about equivalent to the number of megafaunal species on Earth today. So in order to eliminate woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths and the giant camels and all the rest to where they don't even reproduce, you have to get rid of every single individual, right? So the mass extinction at the end of the last ice age was equivalent in scale to basically exterminating every animal on Earth today over 100 pounds of body weight. And that's one way to understand the severity of it, right? Now, when you look at the lifeways of the people, particularly the Clovis and others who were living at that time, yes, they did hunt the large mega mammals to some extent, but they also had a very diversified diet. They were fishing, they were gathering.
Yeah, I've always felt that this notion that the Clovis culture, came in and butchered all the large animals in the Americas is just complete obvious rubbish. But propounded by people who've never spent time with hunter-gatherers. And the gatherers do not do that.
No, they
They
don't.
respect their pride.
You can't cite a single example.
It's not a single example. It's a lunatic idea. One of the very bad things in history and archaeology is a tendency to project ourselves onto the past.
Mm-hmm.
We are a rapacious and destructive species today, but that does not mean that our ancestors were that way. We are causing, indeed, problems in the world today, but it doesn't mean our ancestors did that. And I think it's a kind of projection of the past, of the present onto the past, at least.
I totally agree with that. And I guess to get back to your original question here, when I began to look into some of the critics, because it seemed like their attacks were so vicious and so very appeals to authority, very attacking, actually almost implying the character of anybody who could believe that was suspect. So I began to look into them, I discovered that not just a few of them were advocates of the human overkill hypothesis.
Yeah.
And so if you're staking your academic reputation on this idea that humans killed off the megafauna, you don't want suddenly a comet coming in or a coronal mass ejection or anything like that. And that's what I would say to consider my friend Robert, highly respected everything that he's done, but the people that he is quoting up there to dismiss the cometary impact would say the same thing about a coronal mass ejection. They wouldn't accept that for a second.
Yeah.
However, I think that what we all do agree on is what you were pointing out, that there was something very cataclysmic that happened. My opinion is...
I'll tell you, I'm going to say this frankly and on the record, which is that I've never done this before, but I was unhappy with, and that's why I wish Robert would have joined us and had this discussion openly. I was unhappy with the way Robert dealt with this. There's this big X across the image of the comet. I think that we're dealing with a mystery. I don't think that we, working in the alternative field in this way, looking for answers, I don't think we should be in the business of trying to destroy other people's theories. I think that we should be in the business of working constructively, to build an understanding of what happened. I am very open to the sun being involved. I don't want to destroy that idea at all. I welcome that idea, bring it on, because there's a huge mystery occurred 12,900 years ago. Let's find out what's going on. Let's not spend our time just rubbishing the work of other people, the work of people who've invested their lives and their whole focus for decades on this matter. We shouldn't rubbish it, we should listen to every voice.
And initially there was what, 13, 14 original authors in the Firestone paper of 2007. Is that about right, George?
23.
23, which has now grown to over 60, right?
That's right.
And people like Chris Moore, I mean, he told me himself he initially came on as a skeptic.
That's right. He wasn't on the original paper by far, but now leads the team.
Right, now leads the team. So this is the guy who came on skeptical about the idea and basically came in, I think, probably to debunk it, and ended up looking at the evidence and saying, yeah, the signature of an impact is strong enough and credible enough that, yeah, like you said, now he's a leader of the team. And it's grown to how many institutions worldwide?
I think on the website, commentresearchgroup.org, we list 61 institutions.
61 institutions that
Yeah,
have...
maybe 80 individuals and whatnot. And I would
Yeah.
say every single one of them came as a skeptic first, because they're all responsible scientists. And each of them approached it from a skeptical angle, but an open-minded perspective, and came to join us and publish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I've been looking into recently, and I may have it right here, is, and I've only learned about this within the last year or so, when looking at the role of the sun and the role of comets, and discovering that this phenomenon of sun grazing comets, and that comets essentially end up falling into the sun, either as an intact nuclei, or disintegrating into streams of dust, which ends up being swept up into the sun. Well, interesting research that's come out in the last few years, since we have these new orbiting satellites that are looking at the sun, seeing that when these cometary nuclei plunge into the sun, moving like literally at 100 miles per second, they plunge into the chromosphere, and that triggers a magnetic response, and you have a loop in the magnetic field that rises to the surface of the chromosphere and then explodes outward in the form of coronal mass ejection. These particular comets that they're looking at are very small relative to the to the cosmic scale of cometary sizes. So what that's led me to kind of start thinking about now is if we kind of are seeing perhaps a perfect storm of things that happened at the end of the last ice age that involved using the British neocatastrophist school of Victor Klube and those guys who have talked. Bill Napier, yes, who've hypothesized a cometary storm, right? So if you have a large flux that could have resulted from any number of possibilities, such as a nearby supernova or a passing star, disturbing this deep space reservoir of billions and trillions of comets, then you could send a cascading influx of comets to the inner solar system. And this is one of the viable ideas out there being discussed, is there may be periods of enhanced cometary flux to the inner solar system. So then I began thinking, what happens if you have a large-scale influx of comets and they end up falling into the sun, and if we're looking at a coronal mass ejection being triggered by the infall of an object that's a few hundred feet in diameter, what would happen if an object 50 or 60 or 70 miles in diameter, or even multiple objects, which could trigger an enormous response from the sun? So to me, I don't see it as an either-or situation.
It's a possibly a both situation.
Yes, I'm seeing that we really need to look at the whole range of phenomena and how this larger reality interacts.
I feel the same way, and that's why I'm so sad that we can't have a roundtable discussion about this. Time is running late. We ourselves are tired. We have an audience who've been here all day. Thank you for your solidarity and persistence. It's hugely appreciated. I actually think the next most constructive, if we could go on talking, you and I, Randall, until dawn. I think the next most constructive thing to do is to invite the audience, those who would like to ask questions of Randall and of myself. Please come and do so. Please ask us questions. Do we have a microphone for the audience?